Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. As they said, this is a topic that I become passionate about, and so I can talk for hours. So even though the title of this program is How to Run a Meeting, it is really about how to administer the rules of democracy in a meeting so that you actually have decisions made by majority rule. And even though the book itself of Robert's Rules of Order is really long, it actually takes that many rules to safeguard the rights of the minority and to make sure that every voice is heard and that the majority makes the decision. So what we will be going through today is the role of the presiding officer and the secretary in a meeting, the basic rights of members to attend meetings, to make motions and speak and debate and to vote, actions that may not be taken without a quorum, the standard order of business in meetings, how agendas are adopted, how a meeting adjourns or takes a recess, how to obtain recognition in a meeting. We'll talk about the 6 steps for processing a motion, the rules of decorum and debate, including germaneness. We'll talk about the length and number of speeches permitted in debate, the standard vote requirements to adopt a motion, and how action may be taken by unanimous consent. Unanimous consent and suspending the rules are my 2 favorite topics right now within Robert's Rules of Order. The bylaws are often bylaws are ignored by people when they join organizations because they're kind of boring to read and they're kind of hard to dissect and understand what they're really talking about. But what bylaws really are about are how power is allocated from the membership to officers, boards, and committees. So when an organization first is formed, it's kind of like the big field outside of Athens where everyone gathers and everyone votes on everything. But in order to achieve efficiency, you really don't want to have everyone voting on the purchase of a stapler. And so through the bylaws, you allocate power to officers and boards and committees. And if that power is not allocated, then they do not have that. That is power that is retained by the membership. Power should only be given for efficiency, but too often leadership drafts bylaws that take more power than necessary because they feel like the more efficiency can be gained by taking power that hasn't been given to them, but ultimately it is the membership who decides how power is given away. There are a hierarchy of rules, and this is one of the things that's more complex to truly understand, especially if you get into the rules within an organization, because things have to be done in a hierarchy to determine if they're valid or not. So clearly at the very top, everything is governed by federal and state laws. We're a unique country in that we were founded based on the rule of law as opposed to how most countries are founded. Below that, you have a corporate charter, and then below that, you have a constitution and or bylaws. Constitutions are usually found in older bylaws, and usually older governing documents, and typically what you find now is just a set of bylaws. Then below that, you have the parliamentary authority, which are the rules of order. And then below that, you have the special rules of order, which are a little bit more flexible than what you actually put inside the bylaws. And then below that, you have standing rules, which are generally things about procedure. So if you want like special procedures for handling elections or whatever goes on within your organization, you can do those as standing rules. And because they only require a majority vote, they're more flexible to maintain. And then below that, you have what are known as customs. And these are things that your organization does that aren't necessarily rules, but you've done them historically. One thing about customs is that if a custom is found to be in violation of any of the rules in the stack above them, if a member takes a point of order and the point of order is valid, then that custom has to be dropped. because it can't violate any of the rules governing the organization. So you are a membership organization, and as a member of the organization, you have 4 basic rights. You have the right to attend meetings, you have the right to make motions, you have the right to speak and debate, and you have the right to vote. And what seems to be happening is that people treat meetings like they're going to the movies, and they just watch what's going on, and they don't exercise their rights inside the meeting. But you know, you as a member, you have the right to make motions to do things. You don't have to wait for the leadership to do things or talk to the leadership for permission. You know, you have to think through politically how you want to get things done if you want to do things by making a motion, but that is your right to do so. And no member can be individually deprived of these basic rights of membership except through disciplinary proceedings. So you as someone cannot pick on you just because you ask a lot of questions, or for whatever reason, you know, the leadership is not comfortable with you speaking. Those rights cannot be taken away except through disciplinary proceedings, and you have to do something like violate the rules in order to have your rights curtailed. In electronic meetings, a group that holds such alternative, and this is straight out of the book, a group that holds such alternative meetings does not lose its character as a deliberative assembly so long as the meetings provide, at a minimum, conditions of opportunity for simultaneous oral communication among all participating members equivalent to those of meetings held in one room or area. And over the past year and a half, this has given organizations extreme angst because they just can't conceive of having a open Zoom meeting with 200 people sitting in and everyone having the ability to speak. But really, that is the circumstances inside of a room if you were meeting in a room. And so for your meeting to actually be considered democratically run, you have to have the ability to make certain motions within the meeting that does not necessarily require being recognized by the chair. So like a motion like to a call for the orders of the day, which means we need to get back on the agenda, you should be able to make that if the meeting starts straying from the agenda without being recognized or taken off mute. And that's usually solved by asking everyone to put themselves on mute and then take themselves off mute if they have a motion to make or something to say. And as it says here, under such conditions, an electronic meeting that is properly authorized in the bylaws is treated as though it were a meeting at which all the members who were participating are actually present. Going into the pandemic, a lot of organizations found out that they had not authorized electronic meetings, and because they couldn't meet, they were caught in the box of not being able to meet except by violating the rules. Some organizations got around this by saying, well, this was declared by the state, and since the state rules predominate, then we are allowed to have electronic meetings. And as long as no one extraneously objects, you can get away with that argument. But fortunately, at this point in time, everyone has amended their bylaws and have adopted rules for governing electronic meetings. And so, as this slide says, it is best to develop standing rules for the use of tools like Zoom so that it preserves the character of the deliberative assemblies. And the 3 points on here is that attendees should be self-muted, but able to speak at any time, which would allow for interrupting motions. In Zoom, the polling tool works great for voting. I've had very few instances in meetings I've run where people have not been able to vote using the polling tool. And we just have a workaround for people who can't vote with the tool so that their votes are counted, especially if that's a close vote and their vote would have made a difference. And in a deliberative meeting, I recommend that chat be disabled because if you were in a meeting and there were 200 people in the room, and you started chatting to your neighbor next to you and ignoring the meeting that's going on, you would probably be called to order. And so that's really what is starting to happen with chat, is that people start having a parallel meeting in the chat, and they try to make motions and that kind of stuff. But as the presiding officer, you shouldn't be expected to monitor the chat window unless you have a rule that says that you can do that sort of thing. So I recommend that chat be disabled, and if someone has something to say, they follow the rules of order for speaking. But clearly, if the presiding officer has muted everyone illegally, then you need to do whatever you need to do to get attention. I'm next going to talk about the role of the presiding officer, and as I was saying with the nature of the bylaws, the bylaws give the presiding officer powers in and above what you find in the parliamentary authority. So in Robert's Rules of Order, what these things that I'm going through here are the basic rules of order around what the presiding officer does. So they can open meetings, they can propose the agenda, they can recognize members who are entitled to the floor, they state and put to a vote all questions that legitimately come before the assembly, they enforce the rules of debate, they respond to inquiries, and they adjourn the meeting. And then there are other powers that might be assigned to them in the bylaws. I'm a member of an organization where we have a chair that has become accustomed to making decisions for which she is not entitled to make. And it is really hard in the pandemic to rein her in, because we can't have a meeting where we can talk about it. But we'll be meeting in person soon and have that discussion. There are some things that the presiding officer cannot do. So the presiding officer must be impartial and avoid engaging in debate. If they want to engage in debate, they can if they're a member of the organization. But what they do is that they turn the presiding over to the vice president or vice chair or another officer, so that they can step down from the podium and then participate in the meeting like any other member. And then when that motion has been dispositioned, then they can resume presiding at the meeting. They cannot vote, because if they voted, then they would be impartial, with the following exceptions. They can vote in secret ballots, and they vote to break a tie. So if the vote is 18 to 18, then the chair can cast the vote that would make it 19 to 18 and pass. Because if it was 18 to 18, it would fail. Or if it was 19 to 18 and they were opposed to it, they could vote against it and make it 19 to 19 and cause it to fail. But that's the only times in which the presiding officer should vote. They cannot abuse their knowledge of parliamentary procedure over those who are not as informed. The whole study of democracy seems to have fallen out of high schools, and we have maybe rural organizations like Future Farmers of America who still study this stuff. But really, this is material that many people are unaccustomed to, and so they are not aware of their rights and the procedures for doing certain things. And so they should be able to ask their presiding officer how to do things, and trust that they're giving them correct information. And they cannot be unfair, and they must treat all members equally. The other important role, in addition to the presiding officer, is the role of the secretary, because they are the keeper of the records, and the minutes are the record of the proceedings of the organization, and it's where everything is recorded that is decided. And so this is why minutes are approved by the organization at the subsequent meeting, because they have to be accurate and they have to be kept correctly. In the same organization I was talking about, we had a secretary who never recorded motions, and in particular, motions for bylaws changes, which is really bad, because there have been some changes to the bylaws that I would really like to know how they occurred, but I cannot request minutes that would show when those bylaws changes were made, because the secretary did not record the specific changes that had been adopted by the organization, if they had been adopted at all. So what you would find in the minutes is that Article 2, Section 3 of the bylaws added section blah blah blah, and then verbatim the changes that are that the bylaws were amended by. So you should be able to go back to the minutes and track every change in the bylaws from the beginning of your organization. And of course, any decision that is made is also kept. So if there's any question about how something was authorized, you should be able to go to the minutes and find that out. The duties of the secretary are listed in the parliamentary authority, and then sometimes there's additional duties that are given to them in the bylaws. The next topic is about agendas, because agendas are kind of like the opening moves of a chess game. It's where the meeting is set up, and if you are the presiding officer and you know how to not to do things that end up with results that curtail people's rights, you have the power to do that. So hopefully everyone elects ethical presiding officers, and you don't have that problem. But in its basic form, sometimes agendas are published in advance, and such an agenda is provided for information only. So you might have an idea about what you're going to do in a meeting, and to be courteous to the membership, you've published that. But it's not until you get into the meeting and you present the actual agenda for adoption that becomes what you're going to do. And of course, you adopt the agenda at the onset of the session, and what this is basically is a majority of the members of the organization saying, yes, this is how we are going to spend the next 90 minutes or however long the meeting is, and we've agreed to this being how we're going to spend our time. They are adopted by a majority vote. And when agendas are pending, it's subject to amendment by a majority vote. Usually agendas are not controversial, and you can use unanimous consent to pass them, and no one really bothers. But there are some things in the agenda that you should watch out for, like if there are times for specific things like adjournment, you have to make sure as a member that if there are things on the agenda that you want considered, that enough time has been provided to address that in the meeting. After an agenda has been adopted, no change can be made except by a 2/3 vote, a majority of the entire membership, or by unanimous consent. So once you put the agenda in motion, it requires a supermajority to change what you're going to do. There is a standard order of business that is recommended in your parliamentary authority. And so if your parliamentary authority is Robert's Rules of Order, this is what the agenda should look like. You could supersede this order with a different order in your bylaws, but that would have to be put into your bylaws, which would typically require a 2/3 vote. So you can change this around if you so desire, but if in the absence of an agenda order in your bylaws, this is how your meetings should roll out. So you should start out with the reading and approval of the minutes. Then that's followed by the reports of officers, boards, and standing committees. And then that is followed by reports of special committees. And then that is followed by special orders, which is followed by unfinished business and general orders. Sometimes you hear people call unfinished business old business, but it's really unfinished business left over from the prior meeting. And then finally, there should be an agenda item called new business. I think I've stated what is in the last sentence. So this is the order that should go on, and there's I don't know if I have a slide on that, but under new business, this is where any member can make a motion on any topic that they so desire. There's recesses and adjournments that can occur. A short intermission in a meeting can be proposed by moving the privileged motion to recess for a length of time. Sometimes I get carried away and I forget to, be considered enough to like insert a recess halfway through a 2-hour meeting, and so if your chair is chugging along and you really need a 10-minute break to stretch your legs, you as a member can make a privileged motion to recess for 10 minutes or whatever time that you would like to do. And this is a right that you have as a member of the organization. You can also propose to close a meeting entirely by moving the privileged motion to adjourn. You do not have to go all the way through a meeting, and maybe something's happening where it is preferred to, it is better to adjourn the meeting than to continue on. So any member can propose to close the meeting entirely, even in the middle of a debate on a motion. And so what happens is that motion then becomes as unfinished business for the subsequent meeting, and the meeting ends. And you can also build the recess into the agenda. So if you've got a 2-hour meeting that starts at 6 o'clock, at 7 o'clock you can have a 10-minute recess. And so what happens is that the meeting goes along and you get to 7 o'clock, and then the chair announces that you'll go into a 10-minute recess, and then the chair reconvenes when the 10 minutes are over. And you resume the meeting at the point where you left off. Obtaining recognition. This is something that becomes more problematic in a Zoom meeting because, especially if you have a meeting where there's 100 people in attendance, it is sometimes difficult for the presiding officer to see when someone wants to speak. And so, number one, there should be a rule about how you seek recognition in an electronic meeting by, raising your hand virtually, or maybe if everybody's on video, that you're waving your hand or whatever rule there is to be recognized, then that should be described. But before a member of an assembly can make a motion or speak in debate, the parliamentary name given to any form of discussion of the merits of the motion, they must obtain the floor. That is, they must be recognized by the chair as having the exclusive right to be heard at that time. The chair must recognize any member who seeks the floor while entitled to it, and to claim the floor, a member rises in their place when no one else has the floor, or goes to the microphone in a large hall, or raises their hand virtually in a Zoom meeting and faces the chair and says, "Mr. President," or "Mr. Chairman," or "Madam Chairman." There are motions that are in order when another has the floor and do not require a second. So this is a short list of them. You can call for the division of the assembly, which means that you, perhaps you've taken a voice vote and you don't necessarily agree with the count of the decision of the chair on whether the motion passed or not. So you can call for a division without being recognized or seconded. You can call for the orders of the day, which is the archaic way of saying, "Would you please get back to the agenda of the meeting?" So if, one of the reasons why people hate meetings is that, two people go off and argue about something that the rest of the people don't care about, and they feel like their time is being wasted. Well, as a member, you can proactively, call for the orders of the day and call the meeting back to order. And by saying this, the chair must get control of the meeting back again. So you do not have to sit there while two people debate something inappropriately. You can call a member to order. So if someone has insulted another member and acted abusively, or is behaving inappropriately, you can call a member to order without being recognized. A parliamentary inquiry is where you are unsure of how to proceed with something, And so a parliamentary inquiry can be made without being recognized. And that's because you as a member don't know how to refer something to a committee or whatever the question is in your mind. You don't have to sit there in ignorance and feel bad because you don't know the whole 760 pages of Robert's Rules of Order. You can ask the chair for advice. The point of order is the motion made when you believe something is done improperly. So if something is handled incorrectly, like the chair has taken a majority vote for a decision when it really calls for a 2/3 vote, or if the chair failed to take the noes, sometimes they get they forget to take the noes along with the ayes in a vote. So if there's anything that's being done improperly, you as a member can make a point of order. And then the third one you can make is to request for information, which could be on anything. So, perhaps you need information on the storm that occurred last winter because there's a motion on the floor to spend money for repairs or something like that. You can do a request for information. They all go through the chair, and then the chair directs the question to whoever is most appropriate to answer that. But that is your right to request information. And then you can object to the consideration of a question. So perhaps there's something that is so contentious that it's inappropriate to even discuss in the meeting, and so you can object to the consideration of a question. So motions are the way in which business is brought before the assembly. A motion may itself bring its subject to the assembly's attention, or the motion may follow upon the presentation of a report or other communication. I'm a member of an organization where they are so tired of me saying, well, if you want to do that, you need to make it a motion. But a motion is a formal proposal by a member in a meeting that the assembly takes certain action, and the basic form of the motion, and the only one whose introduction brings business before the assembly, is a main motion. And so an example of this is I move that the holiday party be on July 4th, 2021, or whatever action that the member wants to propose. You often find meetings debating things that have not been stated as a motion, and that's actually inappropriate because you're debating something that's not even been stated. And so you need the actual language of the motion to be stated, and then as we'll see when we go through the steps of the motion, restated by the chair and recorded by the secretary in the minutes. Otherwise, if you're debating something that's not stated, then you're really debating concepts, and you could be actually debating different concepts because you're not operating from the same piece of information. So if you want anything done, it's best to state it as a motion, and in particular, if it's of any complexity, prepare the motion in advance, because it's really hard to state a good motion of any length by making it up on the fly. And there's nothing more frustrating than someone trying to form their concept into a motion while you've got 100 people waiting for them to say what they want to do. These are the 6 steps in handling a motion, and it's actually not common to see motions correctly handled. So this is the formal way in which a motion should be handled, and you'll find that if your presiding officer follows this process, you'll have a greater understanding of the membership, and no one is sitting in their chair going, what are we voting on and what are we debating? Because the chair has made it very clear on what's going on. So the first step is a member makes a motion. So I move that, blah, 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 blah. The second step is another member seconds the motion, because you got to have 2 people in the meeting who want to do this. And if there's some people who second things just because they want to see something debated, but really, if you do not support a motion, you shouldn't be seconding it and wasting everyone's time, especially if it's doomed for failure. So only make a motion if you actually support only second the motion if you support the motion that's being proposed. Then the chair states the question on the motion, and this is where the chair restates what he heard the member say. And then it is what the chair states that the secretary records in the minutes. And then if the chair states it incorrectly, this is an opportunity for the member to correct them, so you get the language of the motion correct. And then the next step is that the members debate the motion. So some people can say, yeah, this is a great idea, or no, this is a really bad idea, and this is why we shouldn't do it. Because the whole concept of debate is that you air your differences and then people make an informed vote at the end of the debate. And this is also the point where you can amend the motion. So one of the motions that you can make is to change the language of the motion if you disagree with it. And there's a whole process around doing that. And there's a best practice for the chair handling amendments so that everyone is very clear about the amendment that is being made. And then when all the debate and the amendments are finished, the chair puts the question, which means that they put the question on how people are going to vote to the membership. And then they count the votes, and then the chair announces the result of the vote. So the parts that are typically skipped are the restating of the question by the chair, and the chair should also restate the question before the vote is made, and that's what helps everyone understand precisely what they're voting on. There are rules of decorum that are expected and germaneness. So during debate, if you're debating the 4th of July holiday event, you should not be bringing in other topics that are not germane. And this is where if people are discussing things that are not germane, you can call for the agenda to be adhered to. You should not, as a member, refrain from attacking another member's motives, even though you are convinced you know why they're doing what they're doing. You really should be debating concepts, not personalities. And then all remarks should be run through the chair. Often you see meetings devolve so that two members are going back and forth between themselves, but really the chair should have control over the meeting and be directing debate. And there's rules that are recommended for the chair to follow in making sure that the debate is done equitably. And then they recommend avoiding the use of members' names. And this is more to not personalize and make anyone feel like they're being attacked. And you hear Congress sometimes, you know, with the gentlewoman from Alabama, please speak, or something like that. So that's what's going on when you see that kind of thing. Sometimes, you know, it's unavoidable to use to not use people's names, and it's not the worst thing to commit. So, you know, just do whatever it takes to get the meeting done without trying to make anyone feel like they're being picked upon. There are rules around the length and duration of debate. So one of the complaints about meetings is that people talk forever and they repeat themselves. But there's the default rules that you find in your parliamentary authority. And then, as I state later in the slide, about special rules. So the default length and number of speeches on a motion is no longer than 10 minutes and no more than twice. Now, you can imagine if 3 people speak for 10 minutes, you've probably consumed a good portion of the meeting. And so, and 10 minutes is a long time. You should be able to state anything that you want to state in debate in 5 minutes or less, and you know, probably more by 3. You can adopt special rules of order in your organization, which shortens this to whatever 2/3 of your organization or more agree to. So you can adopt your own special rules to speak more, like no more than 3 times for 2 minutes, or whatever whatever you ultimately decide on. But I'm sure you've seen debates go on where people have debated more than twice because someone else says something and then they have to feel like they have to respond. But your presiding officer should keep track of how many times people speak, and if someone has spoken twice, then they cannot legitimately speak again unless the membership suspends the rules and allows them to speak again. And as the last line says, yes, you can suspend that rule, but it has to be a supermajority of the organization that has decided to suspend the rule. So you can't just do it because you feel like it's important to be heard. The basic requirement for approval of any action or choice by a deliberative assembly, except where a rule provides otherwise, is a majority vote. And the word majority means more than half. So this is where the whole concept of democracy comes into play. The exceptions to this is a principle has been established that a 2/3 vote is required to adopt any motion that A, suspends or modifies a rule of order previously adopted, or B, prevents the introduction of a question for consideration, or C, closes limits or extend the limits of debate, D, closes nominations or polls or otherwise limits the freedom of nominating or voting, or E, takes away membership. And so this is a easy way of generally remembering the difference between what takes a majority vote and what takes a 2/3 vote. So anytime that the membership wants to take away the right to do something, then that would require a 2/3 vote. Otherwise, it's almost always a majority vote. But this is, if you get Robert's Rules of Order, the specific voting requirements for all of the motions that are available to you are listed in a table in the back. A great tool that helps meetings move more quickly and removes some of the gunk that causes people to hate Robert's Rules of Order is unanimous consent. You have to have a presiding officer that uses this judiciously, but it's great in cases where there seems to be no opposition to routine business or questions of little importance. Then you can use unanimous consent. And under these conditions, the method of unanimous consent can be used either to adopt a motion without the steps of stating the question and putting the motion to a formal vote, or it can be used to take action without even the formality of a vote. And so you usually hear the presiding officer say, if there is no objection, the proposed agenda for the meeting will be adopted. And then the chair needs to give an opportunity for someone to object, because if someone objects, then you do not have unanimous consent. And then if they don't get an objection, then you can proceed. And as you can imagine, this dispenses with taking the ayes and the noes and then declaring the result and all that voting, which in cases where there is no opposition is really not a good use of people's time. You just can't get into a situation where the chair starts rushing through everything using unanimous consent when people object. And that's when you go and say, point of order, I believe the chair didn't give enough time to object. So this is how unanimous consent is done. The chair should state, if there is no objection, or sometimes they say without objection, then the action that the chair mentions will be taken. Or the chair may ask, is there any objection to, and then they should pause. And then if no member calls out, I object, the chair announces that since there is no objection, the action is decided upon. If someone objects, then the chair has to revert back to the formal process of taking a vote and making sure that a majority of the membership, or whatever the vote requirement is adhered to. And I just said that. There are also undebatable parliamentary motions, which sometimes is frustrating because you want to say something. The one that you most often hear is the call of the, I call the question, which is the way to end debate. So if 2/3 of the members of a meeting want to stop debate on something, and it's usually because the debate is starting to get redundant, someone can raise their hand and be recognized to end debate. And if 2/3 agree, you can end debate, but it's not a debatable motion. And there's like another handful of undebatable motions, which the chair should be familiar with. So that is the core presentation. Did we get any questions from the membership?
We don't have any questions, but there are a couple I can ask you once you're done with the ones we have.
Okay. I will next go through the questions that have been submitted in advance. So the first one is, when do you call I think it's, when do you call the question? So as I just stated, this is when you want debate to end because it's getting redundant, or maybe it's getting late in the evening, or for whatever reason. So you can end debate by a 2/3 vote, and it requires 2/3 to vote because you're curtailing people's right to debate. And I just saw last week a recording of a meeting of our organization in West Virginia, where a member yelled out without being recognized, "Question," and the chair said, "The question's been called," and immediately go to a vote. That is not the way in which you handle this. So the proper way to handle calling the question is a member raises their hand, they're recognized, the chair, the person says, I call the question, which means we move to a vote and end debate. And then the chair should say, and it needs to be seconded, and the chair should then say, the question has been called. All those in favor of ending debate, please say aye. All those opposed, all those opposed to ending debate, please say no. And then if 2/3 agree that you can end debate, then you can end debate. You do not automatically end debate just because someone yells out question. That is probably the most abused tool in the book. And so if they do this, this is where you can say, point of order, you did not take a vote on that, and so you cannot end debate. The next question is, at what portion of a meeting should the public be permitted to make comments? So we talked in the beginning of the presentation about the rights of members. And so the bylaws define who a member is. You find meetings like county commissioners, where the membership of the Board of Commissioners are like the 5 commissioners or however many you might have. Those are the members for the purposes of that meeting. And by, probably by state statute, you have mandated public commenting times. And so what you see on the agenda is specific points in time where the presiding officer opens up the meeting for public comment, and then they close that. So it's very clear when the public can speak and when they cannot. If it's an organization that's not governed that way by the government, so no one attending a meeting who is not a member has the right to speak. They can ask, a member can ask that the rules be suspended to allow them to speak, but it has to be agreed upon by the membership to allow a non-member to speak, unless it's a circumstance where it's governed by state law and they have the right to comment. How thorough do minutes need to be? The minutes, first of all, you do not record in minutes what is said. You record the decisions that are made. An exception to this, and this happens in my county that I live in, so the open meeting laws require the clerk to record the debate. And so if it's, and because the statutes, Oregon statutes, supersede the bylaws and the parliamentary authority, then that's what the county clerk must do. But in the absence of those kinds of rules, what you keep in the minutes are the wording of the motions and then how motions are dispositioned, and if a vote was taken, what the vote was. And new to the current version of Robert's Rules of Order, you keep the you enter the tally from elections in the minutes themselves. So all the information that goes on the tally sheet is also put into the minutes. And that would be how many votes are received by each of the candidates and how many votes it was required to be elected. The minutes shouldn't go beyond that too much. If points of order are made, you typically record those. And if you have like logic given by the presiding officer on their rulings, then that should be recorded. But basically, it should just be the motions, and then and specifically, if the motions are amended, what the amended motion was that was passed. How to redirect a meeting that has gone off topic. So I've mentioned this a couple of times. And as a member of an organization, you have the right to call for the agenda to be adhered to, and that is an interrupting motion. And you don't need to be recognized, and you don't need a second, because meetings have to follow the agenda that was agreed upon at the beginning of the meeting. And so you as a member have the right to call that. And you know, as a presiding officer, I myself have gotten so involved in the debate that I forgot that that perhaps it strayed off track. And so, you know, the chair should not be offended or get bent out of shape because someone pointed out that the meeting has gone off track. But, you know, this is one of the reasons why people hate meetings, is because they get off track. But you as a member have the right to keep the meeting on track, so your time is not wasted. Next question: if someone was not present at the previous meeting, do they need to abstain when the minutes for that meeting are approved? If you do not have a rule that prevents them from voting, then they can actually vote. And I know this doesn't make any sense, but you know, if you were not at the previous meeting, that does not prevent you from voting on the minutes presented at the subsequent meeting of the prior meeting's work. Again, if you have a rule that says that any member who was not at a meeting cannot vote on the minutes, I've never seen a rule like that, but you could actually pass one. So you have actually great freedom in which to create rules, and as long as they are agreed to by a 2/3 vote, then it's permissible. Are there any rules about electronic communication between a group of members during a meeting? For example, a group within the membership emailing or texting with each other about the issue being discussed, commenting on the speaker, or deciding how to vote. The discussion is not open to the whole membership, just the group on the email chain or group text, in essence, a meeting within the meeting. So as I was saying about the chat, you know, it is not good to have a parallel meeting going on that's visible to everyone. And it would be best if you had rules that really outline the use of the chat. You know, in this day and age, you know, you can be sitting there with your phone, even in an in-person meeting, and be on an app like Signal and be texting other people. And so as long as you are not disturbing the meeting, it's allowable. There's nothing saying that you can't do that. You should have rules governing the use of that kind of thing. Otherwise, this ends up being starting to encroach on people's rights to discuss. Certainly, you can't disrupt the meeting, but you should be able to, you know, discreetly communicate amongst yourselves. It does get to be a problem if you're spending so much time watching your phone and communicating that you lose track of the meeting, and so that's not a good thing either. So this gets into a little bit of a gray area, but ultimately you should govern this kind of behavior with special rules. And so, you know, you have all rights at the beginning, and so to relinquish the rights to do these kinds of things, you need to agree upon the rules to do so. So those are the questions that have been submitted in advance. Are there any other questions?
So I got a couple for you, Larry. So we did get one in the chat. After the agenda has been published, is there an opportunity for a member to move, to amend, or add a topic?
Absolutely. So once an agenda has been adopted, you can, there's a couple of ways to handle that. You can move to, the language you use is I move to suspend the rules and then do something different than what's in the agenda. And maybe the governor showed up at your meeting and someone wanted to allow the governor to speak, and that's not on the agenda that's been agreed to. And so you would say, I move to suspend the rules to allow the governor to address the organization. And usually something like that is agreed upon by unanimous consent, which meets the 2/3 threshold. And so you can do it that way. You can also move to rearrange the agenda. So you can say, I move to move the consideration of the purchase of a truck to the next general meeting as a special order. So you can do that as well. There's the old-fashioned way of postponing something. So you can lay it on the table, which means that when an agenda item comes up, you can say, I move to lay the motion on the table. And the language for this comes from Parliament. So you've probably seen pictures of Parliament in the UK where you've got the bleachers on both sides of the room and then the big long table in the middle. And so literally what that meant was you were discussing a bill and someone says, I move to lay the bill on the table. And so they physically put the bill on the table. And then that discussion of that was suspended until someone moves to take that issue from the table. So that's another way of altering the order of business. But yeah, and it just requires a 2/3 vote or, of course, unanimous consent to change the agenda.
Next question. For an organization that has a system council body, a bigger body, and then we have committees, and then we have a board. When we say members, we talk through member rights of who gets to call motions and participate in the meetings. What defines membership in terms of each group? So I guess if I'm at a committee meeting, the rights of the folks participating are the members of that committee that have been assigned, or are they the larger membership?
Yes, and this is an excellent question. So the members are defined in the bylaws. So your basic membership is your governing body, and so the qualifications for being a member should be outlined in the bylaws in the membership article, and hopefully it's clear enough that you can tell if someone is a member or not. Then when you get to committees and boards and officers, it should be clearly defined also in the bylaws how the membership of those are composed. So if there's a board of directors, there should be a process for electing them. And then when the board of directors meets, or the executive board, then it's very clear who's been elected to that, and then they are the members for the purposes of that meeting. And anyone else is basically a guest. And so you might have a rule that anyone can attend any meeting and observe the meeting function, but unless they are the defined member, then they do not have the right to speak. And you also should have very clear rules about who is on a committee. And sometimes people get put off by the formality of this, but really, when it's really important to know who can vote when you get down to voting on things. So you don't want the membership of a committee to be so porous that you can overwhelm it with majority and start packing the committee and making decisions in a group where there was a much smaller group that had been deciding. So it should be very clear, either by being appointed, or by volunteering at a meeting, or by electing by some process in your organization, how you get onto the committees. And then the appointments or elections, or however process is outlined, should be, those decisions should be recorded in the minutes, so that if you wanted to know who is on the holiday committee meeting that was created last July, you should be able to go to the July minutes and see who was put on that committee, and then those are the people who have the right to vote and speak and do all the other stuff in debate.
Great.
So I hope that was clear enough. If it's not, let me know.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to combine two because I think they can flow into kind of an A and B. So here are the two questions. In committee meetings, is the chair of the committee the presiding officer? And does this mean the presiding officer does not vote? And then subsequent to that, as you get through that question, if it is true that the presiding officer cannot vote, does that mean their presence does not count towards the number needed for a quorum?
As with many questions, the answer of this is it depends. So there is a section in Robert's Rules of Order, if that's your parliamentary authority, that is called meeting rules for small boards and committees. And personally, this is the one that gives me great angst, because I'm not comfortable with them, but they are the rules that have been laid out. A small board is defined as being roughly 12 or less, and a committee is a committee. And so the abbreviated rules for small boards and committees are there to make to dispense with some of the formality. You do not need motions to be seconded, and the presiding officer can engage in debate, because it says that sometimes the presiding officer is very knowledgeable on the topic that the committee is being convened for. And they can vote. However, if I was chair of a committee, I would not vote except by the same rules as the main body, because I think the rules of impartiality should be preserved. And then the question of do they have the right to vote, and should it be counted in the quorum? And then should they be the presiding officer? So first of all, the chair is typically the presiding officer, unless there's a rule that says otherwise. You can also remove the chair as presiding officer if maybe they showed up drunk to the meeting and they're just horribly screwing things up. And so by a 2/3 vote, you can move to you can remove them as presiding officer and install someone else. And then, do they have the right to vote? And it depends on how the rules are written. And this is an area where I'm not. It really should be clearly described in the parliamentary authority. So, or in the bylaws. If they were elected or appointed to a board, then they are a member of the board and they could vote. If for some reason, like you might have a chair of a committee who's just an extreme introvert and does not feel comfortable presiding and would like someone else to preside, then if there's no provisions in the bylaws for an alternate presiding officer, they can request that the committee allow another person to be the presiding officer. So you can do that as well. But if they are a member of the group, then they should be able to vote. I think I hit them all. Did I miss any?
I think so. So I think I just want to recap in sum for this one that yes, the chair of the committee is the presiding officer unless something else happens. Under a specific section of Robert's Rules, they can't vote if they're a small board or committee, but that gives you angst. And they do count towards the quorum. right?
Yes, if they're a member, then they count
Right.
towards the quorum.
There we go. All right, next question from the chat. For library board meetings, are staff members considered to be members of the public? And would this mean they can only speak during the public comment portion? So we have library boards here that are comprised here in New Jersey. They're appointed by an elected official, the mayor. And so that's who's on the library board when they get to a board meeting. Staff members can attend and sometimes are called upon for their expertise. But I guess the question here is for members of, or for staff members of libraries, would they be considered only allowed to speak during the public comment of the portion of the meeting?
You often find staff members giving reports, and usually these are, they should be listed on the agenda. So if you've got like the building committee, then there should be like the building committee listed on the agenda, and then someone from the committee should be able to speak. And so it sort of depends on the circumstances, but if they are not a member, but they're a staff member and they're just presenting, yes, they are more than welcome to speak if it's an identified line on the agenda that's been agreed upon. They don't have the right to like speak and debate like a regular member does, nor do they have the right to make motions if they are just a member of a committee that is giving a presentation. And you remember when we talked about the agenda and who can make motions, you can have motions coming out of a committee. So you could have a committee report saying, yes, we believe that the existing building can't be refurbished, and the committee recommends the construction of a new library. And so if there's a motion like that, then they can suggest the wording of the motion. And I find this happening a lot in like my county's commission meetings, where the motions are kind of complex and involved, and so they really take advantage of the knowledge of the staff person in the construction of the motion, but the motion has to be made by one of the commissioners themselves. So ultimately, it is the commissioner that's making the motion and is responsible for making that motion. So if it turns out that the library was just an enormous sinkhole of money and it bankrupted the organization, then they could be held accountable for that because they made the motion to do it. But a staff member, unless allowed to by the assembly, either through agreement on the agenda or by agreement of the membership, they don't have the actual right to speak.
Great. Question. It's one of our participants has learned a lot about rules of order from watching congressional proceedings.
Uh-oh.
Is this generally a fair representation of how it's supposed to work?
No. So if you remember the evolution of our governing documents, the whole concept of parliamentary procedure was brought over by the 13 colonies, and they basically adopted what they recalled from Parliament at that point in time functioning under. And so you had 13 colonies, which had 13 governing bodies with their own flavors of rules of order and parliamentary procedure. And then when they got together to write both versions of the Constitution, the first thing that they did when either of those bodies met was that they agreed upon the rules by which they would operate by. And so then from that, you had the creation of the Senate and the House of Representatives. And then those two bodies went off and created their own rules. And so that's why you have a set of Senate rules and you have a set of rules for the House of Representatives. The Senate rules were initially written by Thomas Jefferson, and he went back and studied Parliament in the UK and parliamentary procedure, and did his best as he could to formulate what became the rules of the Senate. And then a similar process happened in the House. And so you see things like the filibuster occurring in Congress or in the Senate particularly. But if you go through Robert's Rules of Order, you will never find filibuster mentioned because it's not really a thing. And a filibuster, the history of the filibuster, it used to be you could speak and debate and no one could stop you. And so you could talk for as long as you wanted to, like Jimmy Stewart did in the movie. And now it's just been abbreviated to anyone saying, I put a hold on this motion without ever having to go through the process of speaking, which something that President Biden said he would like to bring back when he was first elected. So what happened in the civic life was that General Robert was asked to run a meeting, and it was a complete disaster because he thought he knew how to run a meeting, but it turned out that he was not understanding. And so he went off and wrote Robert's Rules of Order, which is a really, really pure distillation of the concept of democracy to be adopted by organizations. And so if you want to see how something really should be done, Robert's Rules of Order is a really good model for it. What you see happening in Congress is not such a good model. I've seen, even their own rules, I've seen them break them. You just have people say, point of order, you cannot do this. And then the committee chairman just completely rolling over objections made by members. There were some hearings earlier where behind each of the congressmen in the hearing was someone standing behind them with a suit and tie. And it appeared to me that every one of the members had their own parliamentarian who would then step up and whisper in their ear, procedural things, just because their organizations are so unique. So no, that's not a really good model, both in the terms of the rules that they have to govern them and by the way the rules are administered.
Okay, one question about a clarification on what we said about texting during the meeting and about what constitutes a meeting within a meeting. I know you said that texting between folks, there's nothing against the rules, but I guess at what point, other than distraction, does communication between parties during a meeting become a meeting within a meeting?
So the chair should really rule on this. If the chair feels that the meeting is not being properly attended to, then the chair can say, please, membership should stop texting because you're being disruptive to the meeting or you're not paying attention to the meeting. It's really up to the chair if you do not have rules to govern this sort of thing. So, first of all, if it's a problem, you should pass rules and agree upon behaviors for your meeting. It is the chair's responsibility to ensure that the meetings are run well, and if they find something happening that is disruptive to the meeting, they should call it out. If the membership disagrees with the ruling of the chair, then there's a process called appealing the ruling of the chair, where that decision then is put on the body to really make the determination. So the chair can say, people, you need to stop texting in this meeting, and someone can say, I appeal the ruling of the chair, and then the membership can decide that texting is okay or not okay. So
Right.
I'd recommend having rules around it.
Another question from the chat. If the bylaws have been changed to include virtual/Zoom meetings, can the board decide to hold a meeting virtually if proper notice is given?
It depends on how the wording for the authorization is written, but probably yes.
Okay. Anything we should look out for in that?
I think I hit most of the main points. I mean, you should be very clear about how voting occurs. You just can't assume that the polling or raising of hands or whatever is sufficient. So you should really write a set of rules around electronic meetings that help protect people's rights. One of the probably the most evolved section of Robert's Rules of Order between the 11th edition and the 12th edition is the whole subject matter of electronic meetings, because there had been about 10 years between those two editions, and it was exactly the emergence of virtual meetings that is having the biggest impact on the way meetings are conducted. And so that's where the rules were expanded. There's different flavors of electronic meetings. So there's a hybrid meeting where, and there's organizations that are now proposing those, where members have decided that we like virtual meetings to the point where we really don't want to travel 2 hours to get to a meeting, and so we would like the ability to have a hybrid meeting. But again, you need to develop the rules to govern those things so that the people that are attending virtually have their rights protected, especially in terms of being able to speak, and the bi-directional oral communication needs to be protected. And if there's some special rules for making privileged motions, then those should be addressed as well.
Right. Well, I know we're coming to the end. I'll just ask this to kind of lead us to, I think, what your last slide is. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I guess as we all sit here, knowing what we want to do, can you give us sort of last words of wisdom in terms of what are big things we ought to really remember out of this presentation, and then again you can talk about some of your further studies.
Well, the major thing is that democracy is a participatory sport, and like I said, many of us have gotten into the habit of treating meetings like watching movies, and really it is incumbent upon the membership to ensure that their rights are not being violated. And you can't get wrapped up in hurting people's feelings when it comes to your rights in meetings. And so the primary thing that I hope people do is that they understand that they do have these 4 basic rights. If they are a member of an organization, they have the right to speak, they have the right to attend meetings, which means that they should be receiving proper notice, and that there's not excuses like, well, we didn't have your email address. I mean, that's not a good reason to not invite someone to a meeting. Just make sure that your basic 4 rights are being protected, and then to what extent is possible that you either have someone who has greater understanding of parliamentary procedure, or you delve into it yourself so that you are aware of your rights. Most people I know who get involved in the study of parliamentary procedure are someone whose rights have been violated, and that they want to learn how to assert their rights and not be screwed over by leadership. And I'll talk about the 2 books that talk about this stuff. So these are some of the topics which I teach, and I'm doing this more and more frequently because there are more and more people that are recognizing that the rules have been weaponized to the point where their rights have been taken away, and we as Americans have this fundamental concept of democracy, and we get a feeling when we know that our rights are being taken away. Sometimes they're imaginary rights, and people imagine things that they don't really have the right to do. But it's important to know what our rights are. So I teach a class called "Why Use Parliamentary Procedure and Rules of Order," which talks about the whole toolkit of that you get when you adopt a parliamentary authority that makes meetings not only fair but function properly and efficiently. I teach a class called Democracy and Civic Organizations, which is really customizing what I went through today and how it applies to civic groups. As I said in the beginning, one of my most popular classes is how to be a presiding officer. And this is actually for anyone who wants to study the material, because it's not only how a presiding officer should behave, but for a member to know how how a presiding officer should behave and how to know when they're behaving improperly. That's a 5-course class that goes, does a high-level overview of the key points that a presiding officer needs to know. I do teach a class on correctly recording minutes, and this goes through what should be and what should not be in the minutes. And then I have examples of really well done minutes that people can use as models. Then I teach a class on understanding bylaws, and what this does is it demystifies the articles. And so what we do is we go through the basic articles that you find in bylaws and what you should look for in each of the key sections, like under meetings, like how meetings are called, how much prior notice do you need in meetings, who can call meetings. There should be provisions where the membership can call meetings if the presiding officer is not calling them properly. Certainly the definition of a member is important, and then any powers that are given away from the membership to the board of directors or to the officers, where to find those inside the bylaws. So you can actually take this boring document, which most people ignore, and understand how things are supposed to be done. I mean, if you don't understand the bylaws, then it's really difficult to call a point of order when they're being violated because you're not really aware of what the rules are. I teach a class on nominations and elections and voting, which is also part of the presiding officer class. And then I teach a class on electronic meetings, which goes into all of the new sections that are put in Robert's Rules of Order on electronic meetings. I've actually not taught the next one, Democracy and the Allocation of Power in Political Organizations. And the final one, I've only taught once or twice, but it's about mass meetings and how those should be run democratically, and if they evolve into an actual organization. So if you see something like like some movement, like any of the ones that we've had over the past couple of decades, where a mass of people coalesce to work on a specific issue, there's a way to handle this democratically so that that people's rights are respected. It's kind of an abuse of power to form an organization without having the underlying bylaws put in place, and without having elected people. Even though you would go with who's ever been proposed, you should at least go through the motions of selecting your leadership so that things are not imposed upon you. And so I go through the process of how to conduct a mass meeting, and then that evolves into a permanent organization, how to do that. And if you want to study this further, there's 2 books that are really good. As I mentioned, the 12th edition of Robert's Rules of Order was just recently revised and came out last September. And that's the book with the white cover. And the good news about it is that it has been extensively rewritten so that it is much more readable than the previous version, and they include more examples. And so there's more illustrations of the concepts of democracy. And so even though it is a big book, it is actually a really, really good text, because it starts with the high level concepts of how we evolved parliamentary rule and democracy, and then goes through all of the aspects of democracy. And that's, of course, the parliamentary authority, which 95% of the organizations in the United States adopt to be the foundation of their organization. They have written a complementary book called Robert's Rules of Order in Brief. This was also just recently revived to go along, and it's in its 3rd edition. And what that is an eminently readable book that gives you 80% of the things you need to know about Robert's Rules of Order and parliamentary law. And so that's a really good book to read if you're interested in this kind of stuff. And that's certainly a great first step.
Great. I know we're getting up against time here. Any last thoughts, Larry, before we bring it to a close?
No, I encourage everyone to, if you're a member of a democratic organization, to at least understand and comprehend what your rights are. So, because as a member of an organization, you have a responsibility to do that sort of thing. There's groups that study parliamentary law locally, and certainly on the East Coast, where so much of this stuff was developed when the colonies were formed, and you can find those by going to one of two organizations there, but the primary one is the National Association of Parliamentarians, which has lots of study groups all over the United States. So that's also a great way to get involved with the material. And certainly if you want to discuss some of these concepts, which are kind of hard to understand, with other people that have studied them for years, you can meet those people in these groups. So again, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this today. This is so important in our country where democracy is really under attack.